Malcolm, you got a new book. It is called What's Left: Three Paths Through the Planetary Crisis. And it's great. I love that this feels like a kind of a choose your own adventure for solving climate collapse. Um, and kind of apolitical. I mean, it's very political, but apolitical. And it's like, what is going to be the most expedient and effective way to survival, really, to planetary survival, and for, I guess, humans, continuation on this earth. But can you explain, just break down what are the three different ways, and then I want to take them one by one.
Yeah, so I talk about three paths, three strategic paths for progressives through the planetary crisis, which is kind of like the climate crisis, but a little bit bigger and worse and a little harder to figure out. And so they mostly revolve around the relationship between fossil fuels and the market and the value system. And so the first path is something I call marketcraft. I actually stole it from a political scientist named Stephen Vogel. But I really like the term. I tried to think of like non-triggering titles for the different strategies, and I think I did pretty well for the first two, which are marketcraft and public power. So I didn't say like, oh, this is the liberal one and this is the socialist one or whatever, because I don't want people to be like reactive identity-wise. I want them to like think through the strategies on their own terms. And then the third strategy is communism. And so I clearly failed on the non-reactive titles, but I couldn't help myself.
Yeah. Well, I love it. And then I kind of just like, just kind of ate it.
I tried.
But it's good.
I tried to lie to my readers, but I couldn't do it.
Well, I'm excited to talk about specifically communism, but in terms of marketcraft, well, first of all, you said something just there, which was like, it's not just the climate, it's planetary. Can you tell me what that means?
Yeah, so I use this analytical lens called social metabolism. And so that means we're not just looking at production, but reproduction, maintenance, repair, all these different ecological cycles that we don't usually think of when we're thinking about economics. And so the climate crisis is too often turned into a sort of numerical question of how much CO2, how many degrees or whatever. And that's wrong. It's just a flat out incorrect way of understanding the crisis itself. And so the planetary crisis, I want to get away from this idea of just measuring carbon and, number go up, number go down, understanding of what is a crisis in all of our ecological and social systems, right? At every level, this is a crisis that's affecting us. And it's one crisis at the level of the totality. And the totality for us is the planet in which we live,
Yeah. And I think you also talk about, and we don't want to have to get into it too much, but yes, the way, like, you don't have to be invested in an oil company or an oil, baron to be sort of propelled or compelled to be part of a very fossil fuel economy, or economy that does a lot of planned obsolescence or relies on petroleum in all different ways. I have a coffee machine that just broke, and it's more expensive to fix it than to buy a new one. You know what I mean? And it's like all this bullshit. It's just like, that kind of bullshit. I mean, this is just me. And also like the perpetual.
Well, it's not just you.
That's just me right now. But yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think the other thing you talk about is sort of the perpetual need to create value. Like the repair has to create value for somebody, but the has to create value. And we always, something has to always create value economically or and definitely not socially. So I love that. I love how much you problematize it. Like, we are entrenched in this, even when you make individual decisions to try to not be.
Absolutely. If we were going to shut down every oil company in the country tomorrow, if the radical leftists won and they say we're going to shut it all down and keep it all on the ground, there would be riots. And there would be riots because people need that oil to drive to their job where they have to make a living in order to feed their family, but also because, retired teachers depend on their pension funds that might be invested in oil companies, right? Or invested in other funds that are invested in oil companies. Yes. And so we're all tied into a system around fossil fuels. It's not just an issue of, some greedy capitalists at the top or some short-sighted politicians. We think of this as a problem with a couple people at the top, but that's not really what's going on. It's a problem of our social metabolism itself. And so any strategy that's even going to be like analytically viable, any strategy that has any chance has to address that problem, not the problem of like number too high, right? Because you can just say like, oh, we're going to invent robot trees, and the robot trees will make the CO2 in the air go down, and so like problem solved. Even though we haven't done that yet, but like we'll just eventually do that, and so like, and that
No, but I was at a tech conference
they
around
think
the
he's
Paris.
real. Yeah.
Well, I was at like the Paris, I was at the Paris Climate Summit years ago, when there was hope or whatever. And and when I went to this like tech expo to kind of clown on everybody, and one guy was like, "We our company is called Sky Mining. We basically mine the sky for carbon." And and it's just like, oh my god, they're gonna mine the sky for CO2 in order to like put back into the atmosphere. What are you talking about? Anyway, market craft, the idea that capitalism can be used as a way to get out of this, and incentive structures, and making it more perhaps appetizing to and profitable to invest in green energy. That is what I understood from market craft, but explain what it is and maybe what's an example of it being tried.
Yeah, market craft, I think it's important to distinguish market craft from market-based solutions that are further to the right or further to the center. I think market craft is still a like solidly, or can be a solidly left-wing idea, which is it starts with the premise that markets are tools that people and societies of people use to accomplish the things that they want to do. So markets are not like the truth of human nature. It's not some like ancient god that we have to appease. It's not the condition for our existence. Markets are tools. And so markets have specific features that are created by policy that people come up with. And so if we want a market that produces decarbonization, we got to create a market that yields decarbonization. And so when a metaphor I use in the book is like complaining about the outcomes of your markets is sort of like complaining about the quality of the cucumber sandwiches at your imaginary tea party that you created. It's like, if you want a different outcome from the market, you got to create the market differently. And so an example that I write about in the book is the Montreal Protocol that ended the use of chlorofluorocarbons when people realized that they were blowing a hole in the ozone layer. And the United States was actually instrumental in leading that process because the United States government said, we're not going to use and allow the use of chlorofluorocarbons in our state anymore. And that'll put them in a position to lead the international effort to stop their use globally. And industry by industry sort of pull the permission slips for using these chemicals as scientists approve alternatives. And that was an example of how you could rig markets and use them as a global tool, not even just a national tool, but as a global tool to yield the kind of outcome that you want. And by creating the rules, by setting the rules that you want, and recognizing that markets are not, private actors don't rule us. We create the conditions for them to operate. We are always creating the stage for private actors to play out.
So you don't see market craft as just, because I imagine it, I mean, what I was reading about it, I was reading the book and I was reading that part, I felt like it felt much more like Inflation Reduction Act, like incentives for moving towards more sustainable, like tax rebates basically for like EVs or, heat pumps, which I really want my landlord to buy.
Right.
And will never happen. But you're saying even just regulations, even just having some regulatory structure on the market, I don't know, is that can also be market craft.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can use like positive market craft. You can use like carrots, right? And say like, well, yeah, we'll give you an incentive to do this. We'll give you tax rebates, the IRA kind of stuff, and even much like further than that. But you can also use sort of a negative market craft and say like, you can't do this. This is banned, or these are the taxes we're going to put on you for doing this socially deleterious activity, or even be just to slow you down, just to make it easier for other technologies that we think might be socially better to compete. Up to saying like, oh, you can't burn coal for energy anymore.
Yeah.
Or like there's a bill in New York about gas-fired Bitcoin mines. And they said, like, look, you just can't do that. You can't use fossil power to power Bitcoin mines. Like that's just too much.
Yeah.
And that's marketcraft. Saying you can't do this is also a form of marketcraft. But then there's also a third category of just like making sure things work and doing like coordination within the markets. So something like setting the electronic protocols that charging stations are going to use to communicate prices to and availability to cars. Like we don't think about that as something that like needs to be done in order for the electric car system to work until you're driving around your electric car and you're like, well, where can I fill up? How much is it going to cost? Do I need to have some special app to pay? Do I have to like register? Like, you know, that could be, if we let the market just do that without state leadership, then it ends up as some like, you know, terrible internet interface where you have to like subscribe for 4 payments in order to charge your car at the last minute or whatever. Totally possible if it's not coordinated better, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't want to just like, talk China up top, but I kind of want to talk China up top because you specifically use that example of like, in China, when it comes to EV charging stations, it's just like a QR code. It's super accessible. It's easy to learn, to know how to pay. Doesn't have to be a specific app specific to a company, where do you place China in this like market craft, and again, approach, even if China isn't necessarily thinking about stopping planetary collapse, they definitely have a lot of crafting of their market.
Yeah, and I think it's clearly the most advanced in terms of using a climate market craft strategy. That China leads the world not just in solar panels and electric vehicles, but also like planting trees, like pump storage hydropower, which I read about as well. So they've created, and I talk about that in the public power section as well, which we can talk about. But I think that's one reason to think of marketcraft not so much as necessarily a capitalist strategy, because China is the country that is perhaps leading every country in the world, not perhaps, but definitely leading every country in the world in terms of their marketcraft strategy. It's really about the use of markets as a tool. And that's the most conservative, the most moderate, the most like already happening strategy that I talk about in the book. But I think ultimately it unfolds to something really radical, which is the socialization of investment, where ultimately you say, we as a society are going to decide what we're going to invest our resources in looking to the future, and that prerogative doesn't belong to a small slice of capitalists, and they can maybe help fund the things they want. They can buy some green bonds, but ultimately like the job for deciding where society's investment is going to go does not belong to them. It belongs to the rest of us.
Does that lead us to then the second option, the second sort of avenue is like public power? It's more of like a democratic socialist approach. The government run renewable planning projects owned by taxpayers, taking the profit motive out, kind of in the way that we think about universal healthcare and single payer. I mean, I'm someone who believes that the private healthcare industry has lost the right to actually, provide healthcare. So, talk about public power. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a lot like what you're talking about, which is not just the democratic socialist solution, but really the socialist solution, right? The socialization of key industries. And so public power is a bit of a pun because I'm talking about the power of the public, specifically public workers who are going to be operating these public things. So if we're talking about, for example, socializing healthcare, that means a lot of people suddenly work for the public now, are public workers, right? And those are the people who are going to be operating these systems, and they're also the ones who need to be driving this process politically and determining how it happens. And so that means power to the public, power to the working class as the universal class of the public. But it also means public power is in like public operated utilities, right? So the like power company operated by the public, where we can't just leave that up to private actors. And I talk about in the book what a disaster it's been to try and rely on private actors in order to make our power system, and the advantages of public power, both the workers themselves as well as a public power production and distribution system for electricity works.
Where do you see that? Like, what's a good example of where that works better especially when it comes to energy or, like, is it just beyond China maybe?
Well, even in the United States, we have a variety of public power agencies and have for a while. So the one people probably know the most about, maybe especially your viewers maybe know the most about, is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a signature program of the New Deal, where FDR said, look, if capital doesn't think it's worthwhile to electrify the South, this, underdeveloped region of the country, which really at that time is underdeveloped, not just like for the United States, but for the world. It's an underdeveloped place in the world. They don't have electricity. And he says, like, look, if we can't rely on these private actors to do it, if they don't see enough in it for them, we'll just do it ourselves. We'll set up a public agency that's backed by the credit of the state, and we'll accomplish the things we need to accomplish. We'll build the infrastructure, we'll build the dams, we'll build the transmission infrastructure, we'll build the nuclear power plants if that's what we decide we need. And we'll make it happen. And those will be built by public workers, run by public workers, maintained by public workers who will be accountable to the public for providing them power, as well as for decarbonizing the system.
These are like massive projects, I mean, I think this is, it's reminding me of Naomi Klein's, This Changes Everything, and her basically saying, climate change and planetary collapse is such a massive existential threat and issue that only with the power of the government can we even hope to try to stand a chance to fight it and stop it. So we have to utilize the money, the mobilizing force, the workforce of the government in order to really have a plan here. And so that's sort of reminding me, I know she has like a sort of a myriad of solutions. Where would like something like, democratizing the energy grid, or the ability to plug in through your own solar panel or your own, wind farm or whatever, rather than having to like pay an electrical company for the, even though you're generating your own power, like, does that fall into public power, you think?
I think that would be maybe more of a market craft solution, right? Because then you're relying on people acting as market actors rather than acting as like citizens, which is sort of what the public power strategy asks. So a public power strategy would ask you to say, subscribe to the local utility company, obviously, where, to plug in your stuff into the wall, which is itself plugged into...
give back right to your neighborhood or community.
Well, and they'll have a solar farm that it won't be reliant on you as an actor, right? Like, that's not your job. Your job is to pay taxes, right? Basically, to support the public energy system, as well as to pay into the public monopoly energy system. Whereas a more market craft solution might say, look, we don't have time for that, or like, in addition to that, we need to incentivize people to do rooftop solar. Which is I think a distinct strategy from the public power. I think there are ways in which these like overlap, and it's all one big Venn diagram. I think, they're like, and I talk about in the book, the overlaps between these various strategies. But I think of something like distributed rooftop solar as more of a market craft, or even a communist strategy, than a public power one. Yes,
we should say that you don't really come, like, you're saying that there could be a myriad of an amalgamation of these solutions, and maybe their steps and at different times. And so I want to talk about communism in a second, but it's reminding me of, I talk about this because I did reporting 10 years ago in Uruguay about their legalization of marijuana. And they studied all these examples from the United States to Portugal, to the Netherlands. And they kind of had this mixed approach of, we're going to have like government subsidized, marijuana cannabis farms. You're going to register with us. We're going to redirect funds that we make, the government makes, into treatment, into prevention, and in terms of addiction and substance abuse. But we will also allow individuals to have like their own cannabis plants in their homes up to 30, and you can have like, but you're not allowed to sell it. It's like people can like come and take, and you give something like this. So it was like trying to democratize things, but sort of, again, a mixed approach to what they felt was like the illicit drug market that they wanted to kind of stamp out, that they didn't, that was leading to crime and whatnot. So it's kind of reminding me of this, which is interesting, but we could talk about communism too. Let's when you said the word communism, when I read it, I was like, my mind immediately goes to like, okay, revolution, gotta do rev, then the state, the new state, does some sort of top-down implementation of, how we're going to survive the out of the next 30 years. But your book doesn't define communism that way or anything that we've seen in the past. So talk about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are definitely examples of the kind of communism I'm talking about. And in the tradition, the communist tradition that I'm talking about goes back further than Karl Marx, further, past Jesus, like all the way to antiquity, right? Which is the communal organization of people. So it's not a new idea that I'm advancing, certainly, and not a brand new kind of communism, but maybe
so you're taking communism
back.
out of the sort of modern context of how we understand it. It's more like it predates
out of the state communist tradition, because I think a lot of people could read the public power section and then open a section that says communism and say wait, I thought we just did that, right? The workers take over the institutions and they run them for themselves in society's interest. Isn't that communism? And it's well, no, that's socialism. That's its own strategy. We need to understand it that way. And communism is the communal organization of people, and what I talk about as the communist invariant of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, and the organization of society.
And how could that be a solution to the planetary crisis, to the collapse here?
Well, the people have organized communally for as long as people have been around. People continue to organize communally now, and they fight for the ability to continue to organize communally. So we see a lot of conflict between communally organized people who, again, they're 500 million in the world, which is a lot, right? Communally organized people in conflict with resource extraction on behalf of public power, who say look, we need this lithium to build our electric vehicles at our car plants, and communally organized people who disproportionately live near resources, quote unquote, say no, look, this is an important element. This territory is an important element in this ecological system that you don't understand, and you're going to fuck it up. And so one of the reasons we can't do this without that kind of knowledge, without the knowledge of rooted groups of people who are based in particular pieces of land, is that the world is not actually a video game. It's not a Sim City thing where they're oh, look, I found a new clump of lithium. People really think of it as video games, like Age of Empires or whatever, right? It's look, a gold mine, or look, a lithium mine. There's no one else on this map. It's just a system that has 3 variables, and we need to maximize 2 of them and minimize 1 of them or something. And that's not at all how the world works. The world is innumerable overlapping ecological systems that we understand poorly, right? That no one understands as a totality, but some people understand specific parts of it.
Well, and that's when you talk about obviously indigenous people and the wisdom and the knowledge and the ingenuity of indigeneity, as you write. And you talk about native value systems, which I think, a lot of awesome, climate justice organizations work with indigenous groups who are specifically in the crosshairs and fighting not just, again, their own, ostensibly leftist governments or centrist governments against, the erasure of their ecology and their way of life, but also multinational corporations, Shell, BP, whomever. And so I love that. And I think what I'm also reminded of what I was thinking when I read the book was that even the impact of climate change itself, like Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico or Haiti after the earthquake. I mean, earthquake, okay. But the fact that these disasters are actually pushing, in Puerto Rico, there's been more of a back to the land movement around food. And Haiti also less so, obviously, because of, whatever horrible repression and whatnot. But these are places that very much relied on their local food economies and farming and, whatnot. And then got turned into monocrop and, export processing zones and such. But anyway, that the impact also is necessitating this back to the land, if you will, or the native value systems that, we've long forgotten. I think this indigenous activist from he was from Montreal, Art Manuel, who I years and years ago worked with said something like anyone can cut down a whole forest, but like someone who's smart cuts down a third of the forest, regrows it, keeps cutting it down, has that forest forever. Like,
Yeah, and it's important to note that these are like contemporary societies of people, right? We're not talking
yeah,
about like learning from past societies or whatever. These are groups of people who are every bit as contemporary as capitalist society, and in fact will plan to and will probably outlive capitalist society, right? Like there are indigenous organized, communally organized groups of people who are going to outlive this crisis directed social system. Like
yeah,
that's something we need to understand, and that like we can learn from that process, right? Like the rest of us need to learn from that process, and we can't afford to forsake that knowledge that is present, contemporary knowledge, right? Not like ancient knowledge or like something you fetishized. And so one way I look at this in the book is that like biodiversity is very important, right? That's a key to keeping these ecological cycles going, and that indigenous and communally organized people are much better at maintaining biodiversity than capitalist societies are. That's a like statistical question, right? That's something that the UN has studied extensively of different indigenous people around the world, groups of people, and their stewardship of biodiversity. And like we need to learn how to do that because it's very important, right? And like we can't help ourselves from killing all the insects, and we don't know why, and we like can't figure out how to stop. And like that's an emergency, right? That's an emergency that we need like a solution from other people who are currently alive to like tell us how to fix this. And so when I talk about communism, I'm talking about people who have this sort of who have developed rooted knowledge over time, because we're dependent on that. And so that's the section I talk about agroecology and different forms of ecological agriculture production that we're going to need, because this one is in crisis, right? So it's not a question of like, oh, is it realistic to ask people to give up their current way of living? It's like, well, no, it's not, right? People are going to cling to their current way of living, but for better and worse, that they're clinging to something that's on fire, like they're not going to be able to maintain their existing ways of life regardless. And so what's realistic is going to change very, very quickly. And so we need to have an open mind about what realism really means in a moment of historical crisis.
Well, before we go, I did want to like focus more on the adversaries in all of this. I'm reminded of, I think, what Bill McKibben used to say, and still says, I'm assuming, that, we have to treat the fossil fuel industry like an enemy industry. And when you open the book, kind of explain like that the capitalists making a killing are, no matter what regulations you put on them, they're going to find a way to keep on polluting. They are going to, from their cold dead hands, quite literally from our cold dead hands, they don't give a and then, added to that, I do notice that, like, in the last 10 years, you've noticed the discussion around climate change from the right being very actually clear-eyed about what this crisis is necessitating. So to the point where they're very black-pilled and nihilistic about climate change. They're like, basically, get it while it's good, hey.
Build higher walls,
Totally build higher walls, whatever. Make sure there's hot chicks in, your privatized little country or whatever.
Yeah.
And they are, and I always mention this, but in Trump's like transit authority report or something back in 2018, they were like, fuel emission standards don't matter because we're all going to die anyway. Climate change has already made an impact. And so I guess my question also is around the repression and the repression to any change, the fight against any change from these market forces and from fascists who will not get rid of the value. How dare you say we should get rid of value? How dare you say we should organize ourselves communally versus in families, and in top-down patriarchal structures?
Yeah, well, it's a bad situation, right? Like you can look at the situation and say like, well, the most realistic thing that's going to happen is that fascists are going to win, and we're going to have, a civil war that kills 1 billion people that we lose and are going to live under the climate Reich. You know, and I quote Mike Davis, who has his great statement about realism, the late great Mike Davis, where he says, like, if we're too realistic, we could just turn to stone, right? You can like look into the situation and be so realistic that you can't move.
Yeah.
But like markets, I think realism is a tool that people use to accomplish the things we want to accomplish. And so if your realism doesn't put you in a position to act, to make the world a better place, right, to accomplish what you want to accomplish, or even just to like square up against your enemies, right, to make a good fight, then it's not really serving you, right? Then that's realism that ceases to be a tool and begins to be pathological, right? And a lot of people are suffering from like pathological realism right now, where it's like it's the most realistic thing you can do is throw up your hands and accept like the end of the earth. And like, well, that doesn't sound very realistic to me, or whatever. Or if that is realism, then that's not a realism that's very useful. And so what I wanted to do with this book is give a real sort of like useful climate realism, which is that like, look, people are going to be working under these strategies in the important time period that we have, right? We're talking about years, decades, not centuries. And no one strategy out of these three is going to convince everybody that everyone should become a communist, or everyone should give up their communal societies and become market crafting liberals or whatever. And so the question is, in the period of time that we have, how do we fit these together, right? How do we fit these people who are operating under these strategies together like puzzle pieces in order to build a climate movement that can win? Because that's what we have to do. That's our task. And I think it's one we have to assume that we are capable of accomplishing.
Amen. I mean, I could talk to you for so much longer. I do think that people who have, I think in the last, 10 to 20, the climate movement has really, some of the language I really think is right on. I do think things like a just transition, moving away from fossil fuels, that transition I think is nice. It makes sense. But also, I think my question is around, which one can we afford? Like, which one do we have time to do? Because I love market craft. I'm like, yeah, these fucking capitalists, someone's got to make a buck somewhere. You got to put limits on them. You got to do this and that. But we're also in a time when you do like one regulation and they act like that is communism. So I'm like, why don't we just do the communism? You know what I mean? Like, why don't we do the whole thing? I feel like the Inflation Reduction Act was momentous and important, but also kind of proved just how buck wild the forces were up against. Like, they're gonna freak out anyway. So it's like, we might as well go for the whole enchilada.
Well, I think that's what we need, the whole puzzle, right? And so if any one of these puzzle pieces had all the solutions, then they wouldn't be able to like lock together. And we need something that's going to lock together. We need to walk down all three paths at the same time.
Right.
And part of my hope with the book is that I can convince, the market crafting liberals that like, you need us, like you need communists out on the street lighting fires. You need like the crazy anarchists burning American flags. Like, you need us as part of your puzzle. Like, you don't know what's going to work, and that might work. And you need to make sure that those people are escaping state repression, right? You need to make sure that you're not cutting them off and saying like, oh, don't deal with them, deal with us instead. We're the reasonable ones. Yeah. Because then you'll get eaten, right? They'll eat you alive, and you won't have anybody to burn anything in the street for you.
Do you have any lingering catty thoughts about the abundance agenda as someone like Ezra Klein is making these rounds and saying, that I guess the market craft of some of Biden's policies are the reason that actually we can't get more climate stuff done?
I wish it was less catty, right? I wish we were talking more about like how these systems operate. I think like they don't take capitalism itself seriously as a specific historical system. They're thinking about, the challenges of human collective action in general, and like game theory and stuff like that. And I think that's the wrong way to think about how we live under a very particular, specific, anomalous historical mode of production that is capitalism, that says like, if housing prices are going down, then we're going to stop investing in housing, right?
Yep.
If housing is getting cheaper, then we got to get away from that as fast as possible. And like that's a particular irony of the capitalist system. If you can imagine another system where it's like, oh look, we figured out how to make housing cheaper. Let's put a bunch of money in that. We'll build a ton of cheap houses, and we'll have way too much housing, and then everyone can have two houses. You could imagine a society that makes that choice. But that's not a capitalist society. A capitalist society is going to say, we must stop doing this immediately because it's too easy. And I don't think that's the kind of system we can rely on to house everyone, to feed everyone, right? To clean the environment, to deal with carbon emissions, carbon pollution as it exists, right? And so a system like that is always going to say, what are we going to build? How do we produce the next robot tree that's going to scrub all the carbon out of the atmosphere?
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room.